The title of my sharing today is The Battle for Minds and Hearts, Kurukshetra of our days. The unification of Europe and the world was impulsed by decisions of the centennial conclave of the spiritual hierarchy in 1425. It started manifesting with the Renaissance, great geographical explorations, and the invention of the printing press in 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg from Mainz in Germany. This marked the start of the first informational revolution, which caused the church to lose its monopoly on knowledge with the spread of printed books and newspapers. This led to an informational tsunami that transformed the world through development of science, Reformation, and eventually the Industrial Revolution. Today, we are living in the aftermath of the second informational revolution, caused by the explosion of information communication technologies that followed the invention of the internet. The scale of the transformation that has occurred is still not fully comprehended. With the dawn of the Aquarian Age, the floodgates of information have been opened again, and the world of data has flooded our cities and countries, exposing problems that have accumulated over millennia and demanding recognition and transformation. Early idealists recognized the immense transformation potential of new informational technologies and used it to unite people around the world for good causes. However, others on the darker path quickly adapted to the new reality using the same tools to separate people. This has opened a new page in the history of wars, with information wars for people's hearts and minds. The current physical plane war is just a small portion of a much larger informational war raging in humanity. This is the war in and for people's mind and hearts. For the first time, information is a more important weapon than conventional arms. In this world flooded with information, humanity has lost its orientation. It is the duty of the most advanced sons and daughters of the human race to orient themselves and help others to find the saving direction. At this conference, most of us affiliate ourselves with the new group of world servers, a supranational subjective network of people united by their recognition of the reality of soul and our responsibility to serve our fellow men. It is our role to recognize and hold the vision for humanity, using our intuition and understanding of the fundamental spiritual values, principles, and laws. In preparation for this conference, in the circle of presenters, there was we started sharing of our worldview. I didn't have a chance to do that, and so I will do it now. It is crucial to acknowledge and confront the issues that plague humanity, shining the light of our collective consciousness into the depths of our villainy and suffering. As most of us from the Western world, our conversation naturally focuses on vices of our own societies. It is an important phase to recognize and name those. Though I strongly believe it's important to acknowledge that all nations and cultures share in the same collective karma of humanity. We are all facing the same collective dweller at this time. I have been fortunate enough to experience life in both Western and European and Eastern societies. And I can attest that the reality of the latter can be much more harsh. The heavy overshadowing cloud that was mentioned earlier today, that has been lingering over certain parts of the world since World War II, has not dissipated. On the contrary, it has only grown denser. We know the door to where evil dwells was not completely closed by the united efforts of the forces of light. Through active and organized efforts of the forces of evil, this war was ajar again, allowing evil to spread around the world, finding its own ways of expression in every part of the world. In the West, it manifested through various institutions, such as finance, pharmaceuticals, and agriculture. One of the greatest success was to transform the ideal of freedom into the freedom of consumption, which has now spread around the world. My strong impression is that the political dynamic in Russia in the last 30 years allowed evil to express itself directly through the state system. While there was a short period of attempted liberalization after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was quickly suppressed by the sustained traditions of the Soviet state machine. As a result, one person has increasingly focused all political power for the last 24 years, making him an easy target for forces of evil. I recognize and state that in front of our eyes, history repeated itself. Putin became a vehicle for forces of evil, manifesting their will on the physical plane, the same as Hitler did the last century. I would argue that the Institute of Electoral Cycles practice in democratic system does not allow evil to find sustained vehicle for expression through individuals in positions of political leadership. Regular elected country leaders change too quickly to allow enough time for dark forces to establish a sustained control over individual vehicles. They have their own ways to work in the West. Despite the different expressions of evil in various cultures, I believe that the core of evil is the same. Evil disguises itself as different forces, creating an illusion of battle between good and evil on the physical plane. But there is no pure goodness in any existing systems. Systems everywhere are corrupt and crumbling. Decay wrote 70 years ago that no country is free from influence of evil. Unfortunately, nothing changed. As we move through this phase of recognition and acknowledgement, please let us leave our idealism, leave it behind, and recognize our togetherness in facing the collective dweller, the karma we together accumulated through millennia. Let us look forward and ask ourselves, where is the actual battle happening? Where is the actual forces of light, and how can we contribute? In my view, the battle is happening for human hearts and minds. This is the Kurukshetra of our times. Humanity can only survive this war if a vision from a higher plane is presented to humanity, inspiring and leading us out of the miasm and traps of emotional and lower mental battles. In its final instructions communicated via Alice Bailey, the Tibetan master outlined the main work goals for the coming generations of disciples: to defeat totalitarianism as a material goal and to establish the kingdom of heaven as a spiritual goal. According to Decay, the defeat of the evil process, which involves the imposition of ideas and which can be the method of the democratic nations and of the churches everywhere, just as much as it is the method of the USSR. This we call totalitarianism. I would ask you to have this distinction clearly in your minds. Your material goal is the defeat of all that infringes human free will and which keeps humanity in ignorance. Totalitarianism is the basis of evil today. It is found in all systems of government, of education. It is found in the home and in the community. I refer to the imposition of the will of the few upon the total mass of the people. The defeat of this undesirable tendency everywhere is your definite material goal. Propaganda has become one of the main tools of the imposition of the will of the few on the masses of humanity. And in the currently raging battle for minds and hearts, its dominance has exponentially exploded in the informational space. Through propaganda, though propaganda is not a new phenomenon, interestingly enough, we could trace it back to the origins of Christianity and especially to the Catholic Church. It originates from priests' sermons who sought to convert infidels and to distill right beliefs into the minds of their followers. Thus, the purpose of propaganda is to change people's opinions and sometimes to stimulate them to action. Propaganda is not inherently good or bad. It is merely a tool that can be used for either purpose. The motivation behind propaganda determines its effect. Decay used this term often when he wrote about the need to disseminate information related to the work of the hierarchy and the New Age. In a way, primary education is a type of propaganda, as knowledge is imposed on children without much argumentation. However, higher education requires the presentation of opposing views to encourage the development of crucial thinking. The more education a person has, the less susceptible they are to propaganda. The more you know, the more you realize that there are an infinite number of facts that could be combined in a variety of ways. Propaganda does not provide alternative views. It has to be simple and digestible. It provides simplification of the worldview. Most of the time, propaganda appeals to emotions. Therefore, propaganda is attractive for the masses of humanity. People seek a clear explanation of the complexity of the world around them. Often, propaganda aims to explain issues outside of direct knowledge and experience of the targeted audience. That is why international affairs is one of the most common focuses of propaganda. Propaganda styles vary depending on the political system. Authoritarian governments aim to disorient the population and prevent political action. while democratic and totalitarian systems use propaganda to stimulate action. Marketing is a form of propaganda that uses human psychology to stimulate desire to buy things that people don't need. Propaganda is used everywhere in the world, and there is nothing inherently wrong with it. The key is to ensure that alternative views are available and people have the freedom to choose what to believe and express. However, propaganda became evil when there is a state monopoly on it and alternative views are suppressed. This is the case in the modern day Russia, where propaganda is used to promote the totalitarian regime. In this case, I use this term in accordance with the definition of Joel Kuhl. At this conference, the primary focus is what is wrong with the so-called collective West. And today we got a perspective on Russia. As someone with a deep appreciation of Russian culture and personal experience with the country, I feel it is my responsibility to share my perspective and help to form a more complete view of modern Russian history. I was born and grew up in a bilingual Ukrainian family in Kharkiv on the northeast border of Ukraine. I was raised with a deep appreciation for Russian culture. I went to a Russian school and got my engineering degree at the Russian-speaking university. I have also spent time living in Moscow and frequently visited. My wife is Russian. Third of my life, I lived in the USSR. Third of my life, I lived in the sovereign Ukraine. And the last third, I lived in New York. Thus, the perspective that I share today is based on my personal experience. Of course, I realize that my perception is limited, but still, I cannot unsee what I have seen. Many voices within Russia acknowledge that Russia itself is the biggest victim of Putin's political regime. Grigory Yudin, one of Russia's leading social scientists, called it sabotage against the country after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately, the richness and vibrancy of Russia's modern intellectual and cultural life are still isolated from the rest of the world by the language barrier, with only few voices of the Russian intelligentsia penetrating the West. The modern history of the Russian Federation could be described as the phantom pain for the partially collapsed empire. The end of the Cold War ignited collective excitement with the vision of possible freedom and material prosperity. However, the reality of the systemic economic crisis of the 90s, along with the exponential growth of organized criminal activities, pushed the nation into deep shock. The collapse of the Soviet ideological belief system caused a substantial erosion of the social fabric and made this situation even more bitter. All this caused a deep national trauma. This is reminiscent of the situation in Germany in the 1920s after the World War I and the collapse of the German Empire. In search of a new unifying national idea, Russian society deeply resonated with the idea of restoring greatness of the old days. Paraphrasing, we could say that "Make Russia Great Again" was a definite winner for the sixth-rate personality of Russia. The innate national archetype of Father Tsar, a strong leader figure, made Putin's emergence from the KGB and connection with the criminal mobs and oligarchs logical. He organized and used national yearnings for his own benefits, solidifying his authoritarian power, and the new national idea quickly took shape. At the same time, the corrupt tradition coming from the mid-ages and flourishing during late Soviet times of state interference into religious matters got the new impetus during Putin's regime. The Russian Orthodox Church became one of the main ideological tools to fire up Russian patriotism, in return receiving unheard economical privileges and presence in the front line of Russian establishment. Then the Orange Revolution in Ukraine happened. Hundreds of thousands of people across the country demanded fair elections in response to the attempt to falsify presidential election results. This massive social uprising in a culturally closed nation demonstrated the reality of people's power that could influence the political landscape. It became an existential threat to Putin's power, and it defined the political dynamic in the Russian Federation in the following decade. In the years following that, Russia saw a dramatic shift towards solidifying the authoritarian system. All major opposition media outlets were shut down or taken under government control, installing state monopoly for propaganda. At present, all media in Russia are under the government's control. A series of campaigns against opposition leaders and journalists took a heavy toll on the freedom of speech in Russia. Alexei Navalny, Ilya Yashin, Alexei Gorinov, and Vladimir Kara-Murza are in jail for their opposition to the regime. Boris Nemtsov was brutally killed, and many others had to flee abroad. After 2005, I witnessed the Russian government investing heavily in propaganda, using traditional and new communication technologies to create a powerful tool for both domestic and international audiences. This propaganda was used to disseminate various narratives based on lies and semi-lies to justify policies that limited people's freedom and dramatically increased the power of the president. Of all of Putin's propaganda narratives, Ukraine always held a central place. Many in Russia and abroad recognized Ukraine as a missing piece to restore the Russian Empire as a superpower. As most people in Ukraine are bilingual, propaganda quickly became an increasingly aggressive weapon in the fight for influence within my country. Now I'd like just to share some examples of the most notorious and recognizable narratives of Russian propaganda and share my perspective of the real situation in Ukraine as I witness it with my own life. First narrative: the US is a sponsor and an organizer of both Ukrainian revolutions. In the early 2000s, I worked for several US aid and other US government assistance programs in support of civil society development in Ukraine. I always perceived that as a way to stimulate growth of the new group of world servers. The US definitely invested a lot into development of social activism in Ukraine in the 90s and 2000s. And that, in a way, contributed to the activation of the post-authoritarian society, which sequentially led to the civic uprising known as Maidan. But that is just one layer of the story. The Ukrainian government's corruption and attempted falsification of the presidential election was a direct cause of the popular uprising, where people exercised their right to protest. I was actively involved as a private citizen in Maidan protests in both Kharkiv and Ukraine and Kiev in the winter of 2004-2005. I assert it was a genuine reaction of peoples to unjust manipulation of the government without any external influence. It was a moment of the collective recognition of freedom and people's power. That was the time when the soul of the Ukrainian nation was awakened. Following the Orange Revolution, the Russian propaganda machine was flooding people's minds and hearts with anti-Ukrainian myths in both Russian and Ukraine. It was a meticulously crafted inflow of hate and fear, based on twisted partial truth and pseudo-historic myths. Its intention was to provoke people's emotions of hate. It was an unfolding crime against humanity. It directly contributed to antagonization with predominantly Russian-speaking regions in the east and south of Ukraine, thus preparing the occupation of Donbass and Crimea. Though in a way, the same propaganda made Ukrainians even more aware of their own identity and contributed to the protests in winter of 2013-14. The second Maidan revolution became a much more powerful wave. Ironically, Putin contributed the most to this revolution. Seeing what was happening in Russia in 2000s made it clear to Ukrainians they didn't want to follow the same path. Despite the lengthy process of preparing a highly anticipated by Ukrainians agreement of economic cooperation with the EU and therefore orienting towards the West, the Ukrainian President Yanukovych did a 180-degree turn, declaring closer affiliation with Russia and accepting a $2 billion fund transfer from Moscow. Another myth. Ukraine is controlled and run by Nazis. Probably you all heard that, and maybe even repeated. Ukraine has a wide range of political parties and movements, including those with nationalist ideologies. However, they have always been on the fringes of the political process. The only far-right nationalist party, Svoboda, present at the national political scene, had a continuously declining support in parliamentary elections. 10.4% in 2012, 6% in 2014, and only 2%, little over 2% in 2019 last parliamentary elections. The invasion of Ukraine in 2014 caused the formation of far-right volunteer paramilitary groups. The impact of this and similar organizations on both Ukrainian politics and society has since been greatly exaggerated and was cherry-picked by propaganda for propaganda purposes. For sure, the presence of such groups is a serious issue not only in Ukraine, but across Europe, the US, and even more so in Russia. The claim that Ukraine is controlled by Nazis is absurd. It is even more so if we consider that the Ukrainian President Zelensky is a Jew himself. The real reason for using Nazi narrative was a strong resonance with the Russian people that has a strong historical memory formed around World War II and the victory over Nazis. It is a central part of the Russian national identity. Since the early 2000s, Being increasingly promoted by state, the Victory Day in Russia has been continuously growing in its importance. And now it is the biggest occasion to celebrate national pride. In reality, Putin's claim of denazification means de-Ukrainization by annihilation of most active Ukrainian citizens who protested the occupation. The report of the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights situation in Ukraine, released just a few days ago on March 24th, documents multiple atrocities against Ukrainians based on their national identity. The inhumane experience of the war has unfortunately fueled hatred towards Russians among many Ukrainians. But this was not the case before the conflict began. The dehumanization of Ukraine through propaganda aimed to prepare public opinion in Russia for war in Ukraine, much like the humanization of Jews before the Holocaust in Germany. As someone who has lived and traveled extensively in both Ukraine and Russia, I can attest that there was no hate between two nations before the Russian government started heavily investing in it. The use of propaganda to spread hate towards a particular group is a tactic that has been seen before, as in case of Rwanda leading up to genocide in 1994-95. I have to skip some parts of my presentation. You can read it in the chat. I believe Mikhail posted it because time is running. And I want to go to a more important part of the presentation. The part that I skipped is actually related to another claim of propaganda that Ukraine is an artificial formation that Russia has created within its borders. So please read it. I want to talk now about informational warfare. Russian propaganda targeting Western democracies is much more complex and layered subject. The occupation of Crimea is an indicative example of the Russian information warfare tactics. I saw how within the first days and weeks following the invasion, Russian officials denied the presence of their militaries in Crimea. You probably remember this. These officials generated in clouds of lies in response to international inquiries about the unfolding events. It was interesting to observe some so-called alternative independent media sources in the West repeating the same nonsense just to switch days later to a new narrative sent from the Kremlin, explaining the presence of Russian troops in Crimea with the need to support the freely expressed will of the people. As I delved deeper into this topic, I realized how deep is the rabbit hole of Russian infiltration targeting Western democracies. It is more appropriate to use the term informational warfare, which is part of a new official military doctrines on both sides of the combat forces. According to several sources, including the US Department of Defense and the Russian Ministry of Defense, information warfare involves the confrontation between states in the information space with the purpose of inflicting damage to information systems, processes, and resources, critical and other infrastructures, undermining the political, economic, and social systems, a massive psychological manipulation of the population to destabilize the state and society, as well as coercion of the state to take decisions for the benefit of the opposing force. According to General Valery Gerasimov, chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, the ratio of non-military to military measures in the modern security environment is 4 to 1. 4 to 1. Even without war, states engage in an information struggle, trying to influence each other's perceptions and decisions, making while targeting decision making while targeting populations, both domestic and foreign, trying to influence their consciousness. Here is a quote from a political military dictionary edited by Russia's former ambassador to NATO, Dmitry Rogozin. Information warfare aims to influence the consciousness of groups in society, but also to change their knowledge about basic social and natural phenomena, weakening their will to counter aggression. To change their knowledge about basic social and natural phenomena. By the way, the use of the word consciousness, it's a quote. They're talking directly about influencing people's consciousness. It's important to recognize that the information we consume is not just information, but a weapon covertly developed and delivered in a tailored form to weaken our will to counter aggression. Russia is targeting the West through a divide and rule approach, using multiple tools of influence. The population is mainly reached through media and social media, exploiting divisive issues. Minorities, refugees, and extremists are used to further this divide and rule approach. Human intelligence and cyber operations are important cover tools of influence. Russia has also uses the energy sector, business, and corruptions as venues for influence. It has an extensive network of allies and front organizations, and reconstructs reality and rewrites history to legitimize itself and undermine others. Buckle up, Dorothy. This is not Kansas anymore. An example of reconstructing reality techniques is to blame any current situation on Western hostile actions and ignorance, and to create the impression that Russia is only reacting to Western aggression. An example, for the Baltic states, with their large Russian minorities and long history, Russia has developed a comprehensive narrative covering both the past and the present. It's focused on the Baltic states' support of Nazism and the Soviet Union as the savior and winner of World War II, while at the same time omitting Soviet oppressions, occupation, and deportations. I can share some resources that I used for this research, for your further research. Some people might suggest that Russia is fighting for good causes or a big idea, but in reality, there is no sign of any such idea emerging from the country. We observe only one big idea: chaos to the world. Russia is challenging the current international system of cooperation without offering any viable alternative. Russian state propaganda openly threatens the West through its talking TV heads to transform Western capitals into radioactive ash, and proclaiming that Great Russia should spread to Lisbon, while Russian soldiers will wash their boots in the waters of the Atlantic. This is quote. I personally believe that the great idea Russia was supposed to bring to the world is the brotherhood, as we heard here today already. A concept that resonates with the Aquarian age and the soul of the nation. However, in practice, Russia's idea of brotherhood has been inverted and brought to its neighbors as denazification, resulting in the deprivation of their Russian high mission. I recognize the Russian soul being imprisoned, the same as the beautiful princess captured and put in lethargic trance by infernal Tsar Koschei in prophetic Russian folktale. I have faith that one day a brave hero will emerge to defeat Koschei and awaken the princess with his kiss, just like in a fairy tale. The people of Russia will rise against the imposing evil and awaken the soul of their nation. Grigory Yudin, a Russian social scientist, asserts that a popular uprising in Russia is inevitable, and it's just only a matter of time. As we see what is happening these days in other countries like Israel, France, Germany, and what has happened twice at this century in Ukraine, we know the same will happen in Russia. I believe the great Russian Revolution is coming, and Pluto on its way through Aquarius will help the hero to awaken the beautiful princess. And finally, what about Kurukshetra? It's a powerful symbol for all students of ageless wisdom. It's also known as Dharmakshetra, the field of Dharma, or field of righteousness. In that battle, Arjuna, the world disciple, was prompted by Krishna to stand for what is right, to fulfill his dharma. 5,000 years later, we stand together as a group Arjuna in the midst of the raging world Kurukshetra. The same we have to act fulfilling our group dharma, defeating totalitarianism and manifesting the kingdom of heaven on earth. Let us at this conference recognize together what we can do to succeed. Here is my contribution to that. We need to practice the skill of recognition and discrimination. The Tibetan directed us to recognize the nature of forces hiding behind the masks by techniques and methods they use. As Christ told us, you will recognize them by their fruits. We have to turn our eyes to the source of light, our soul. Holding that orientation, we will help others to find their way to the light as they start seeking way out from the dense clouds of deceit. We remember and hold our ground with the foundational spiritual values, laws, and principles, which are not of this world and yet define all the processes of human evolution. Let them motivate all our thoughts and words and actions. Freedom is an essentially spiritual attribute underlying the entire evolutionary process. This should always be remembered as a strengthening and conditioning reality by all men everywhere. It has survived eons of opposition from the principle of enslaving selfishness and is largely responsible at this time for the struggle in which we all are participating. And finally, let us remember Christ's words. Follow me, and let the dead bury their dead. The crystallized systems of the world should undergo transformation. Our work is to support and cultivate forms that adequately can manifest the incoming energy of life.